As the final hours of 1990 ticked away, the world braced itself. Experts warned that when the clock struck midnight, the power grid could fail, planes could fall from the sky, and renegade ATMs could roam the streets attacking pedestrians who couldn't remember their pins. I was taking no chances. While the rest of the world was at parties, I was standing in the dark hallway outside my computer room, hammer in hand, watching my desktop PC for any sudden signs of disaster. Then midnight arrived. Nothing happened. I went to bed. So what was the Y2K problem really? And how did a bug in some old computer code end up getting more airtime than Britney Spears? Because for most of 1990, it did. Serious people in expensive suits were going on television to explain, with the gravity usually reserved for incoming asteroids, that the world's computers were about to betray us all. And we knew we had to take them seriously, because the suits were very expensive. They weren't entirely wrong. They were just, and this is the important part, almost entirely wrong about how. Here is the actual problem, which I promise is less dramatic than the suits made it sound. In the 1960s, computer memory cost more per byte than a nice car cost per pound. So programmers made a perfectly reasonable decision: store 1973 as just 73. Save 2 digits, save a fortune. Everyone assumed this code would be long gone before it mattered. The code was not long gone. The code was still running banks, airlines, hospitals, the power grid, and a truly enormous amount of software whose original authors were no longer taking calls. When the year 2000 arrived, a computer storing 00 had no way to tell whether that meant 2000 or 1900. Which meant someone born in 1955 was suddenly negative 55 years old. Governments set up Y2K committees. The committees set up task forces. The task forces commissioned reports which recommended the formation of additional committees. Meanwhile, an enormous army of programmers went through decades of old code the way raccoons go through a landfill, patiently, systematically, and with a surprising amount of expertise. Retired programmers got phone calls from strangers offering extraordinary amounts of money to come back and look at code they'd written in 1978. The global bill came to somewhere between $100 and $600 billion. It was the largest coordinated software project in human history, and almost none of it was visible to the public. A genuine Y2K survival industry sprang up, staffed by people who had correctly identified that fear was, from a pure business standpoint, an extremely scalable product. You could buy survival guides, survival kits, and something called a Y2K family preparedness video. A man named Gary North became briefly famous for predicting total civilizational collapse and recommending a return to agrarian life. People bought generators, freeze-dried meals, gold coins, and some moved to New Zealand on the theory that it was far from everything and also had sheep. These people were not crazy. They had simply taken the television very seriously, which in 1990 was a reasonable thing to do. December 31st, 1990 arrived, and for the first time in history, humanity got to watch the apocalypse happen to other people first. New Zealand went first. Midnight came. The lights stayed on. The ATMs behaved themselves. The sheep continued to be sheep. Then Australia. Fine. Russia, which had spent notably less money on preparation and which everyone assumed would be where something went wrong. Fine. By the time midnight reached the Americas, even the news anchors had started to look embarrassed. Somewhere in New Zealand, a man who'd spent 18 months preparing for civilizational collapse had to figure out what to do with 600 pounds of rice. Here is the thing about the anticlimax. The anticlimax did not happen by itself. While the suits argued and the preppers stockpiled, somewhere in office parks and cubicles with no windows, an enormous number of people were quietly doing enormous work. The Social Security Administration alone reviewed 30 million lines of code. Banks audited systems untouched since the Nixon administration. Airlines tested their reservation systems the way you test a bridge before letting a bus drive across it. And when the clock struck midnight, the planes didn't fall out of the sky because people had spent 2 years making very sure they wouldn't, and then went home without telling anybody. Because the kind of person who fixes a date field in a COBOL payroll system is generally not the kind of person who owns a suit. Here is the lesson of Y2K, which is also the lesson of every large software system ever built. Small, reasonable decisions, made for good reasons by people who fully intend to clean them up later, have a way of becoming permanent and then becoming load-bearing. In software, this is called technical debt. Imagine you let one raccoon into your attic on a cold night because you are a kind person. 30 years later, there are 400 raccoons, and they've developed a functioning society with internal politics and a rudimentary system of commerce. You cannot evict them because the attic is now structurally dependent on them in ways you do not fully understand. The house is still standing only because somebody, somewhere, is quietly feeding them and keeping the politics stable.